podcast, this time with Richard Murphy from Richard Murphy Architects. Richard founded Edinburgh-based practice Richard Murphy Architects in 1991. The practice defined their goal as to make architecture equally of its place and of its time, which responds carefully to its context. The studio have completed a number of projects across the UK and Ireland, Europe and Sri Lanka. Richard has also recently published Carlo Scarpa and Castle Vecchio Revisited, a further study of the renowned building, for which he has received recognition internationally. So hello Richard, welcome back to Aberdeen. How was your day so far in your trip?
Fine, thank you very much.
Trip you've done quite a few times, I imagine.
Yes, I used to teach here many years ago.
Oh yeah, of course. Has it changed quite a lot since then?
Completely, new building of course. Mm-hmm.
So you've recently completed the award-winning Murphy House and it won named House of the Year in 2017. Can I ask what it's like living in a house that you've just designed yourself, and is it something that you recommend if they have the chance, every architect to do?
I wouldn't recommend or not recommend it. I would expect most architects deep down want to build their own house. I think it's quite interesting when you scratch an architect, maybe they're not quite so keen because well, first of all, in this country we don't get the opportunity very often because land is so expensive. I mean, if you're living in Australia or America or somewhere, it's much more likely, but here people tend to sort of knock a house around really rather than start from scratch. However, I think I mean to be amusing about it for a moment is you kind of don't have anyone to blame if it goes wrong, in the sense that you don't have a client, it's you, and I think sometimes possibly that can be a little bit terrifying for some architects, that they sort of are very much exposing what they want to do as architects. And I think, and I plead guilty to this accusation, that the danger is you try and put everything into one inevitably small project that you've learnt or seen in your life. So the project can very easily get over-egged, which is absolutely true in my case. I don't have any problem with that, but some people might. So, I mean, there's lots of sort of issues flying around. I also think it's actually incredibly difficult to make decisions for yourself. I found it very difficult. And I think possibly it's a sort of time of life thing too, because it took me 10 or 11 years to actually make the whole thing happen. But I mean, I got hold of the site when I was about, I don't know, I suppose about sort of 50 or something like that. But I realised quite quickly that I wasn't going to build another house myself. So that's an issue because you want to be kind of quadruple sure about everything, every decision you make, because as you can imagine, sometimes you have an idea which is too late or after the event, of course. And I thought it would be terrible to sort of wake up one morning and suddenly think, Jesus, why didn't I do it this way, and then spend the rest of your life sort of regretting it and thinking about it. So I suppose with every design conversation about the house, and it is a whole series of different conversations, I tended to examine it in extreme detail and go into all the different options before selecting the way forward. And in that sense, I had to sit and look at the site for about 4 years during the recession. And I must say, although at the time it was very frustrating, of course, and I didn't know whether it was ever going to get built, but in retrospect, I actually think it did me and it a lot of good, because it gave me time to have a really good think about it and to sort of quote unquote fiddle around with it, So, and that's exactly what I did. So I mean, I think it's I mean, it sounds very egotistical to say I really enjoy living there, but I really enjoy living there, and I sometimes enjoy it so much I find it quite difficult to go to work in the morning, actually. And I've become a bit of a sort of recluse. I mean, I spend far more time at home than I ever used to, actually. So that's a bit strange, isn't it, really? But I'll gradually be sort of winkled out of the place, I think. No, it's very nice, and it's got a little roof terrace as well, which I find it's not just a question of being in the house. You can be outside and still in the house. Exactly. So I enjoy all that. I think it also coincided with working all hours on finishing the book, and so I just became a complete hermit while I was doing that. So that was nice.
Good. How do you see the future of practicing architecture in Scotland and maybe the UK as a whole, as we're going through quite a turbulent time with Brexit and economic difficulties? Do you think it's going to? Is there a positive outlook or maybe a mixed outlook?
Well, I'm talking to young students here, and one doesn't want to be in any way discouraging, and they've all chosen to do architecture, and I think I hope they know by now that it's a very unstable way of earning your living. Look, I think the economy has always gone up and down throughout history, and we've always been buffeted by events. Frank Lloyd Wright didn't build anything for about 25 years, apart from Falling Water and Johnson Wax. That was the only things he built for 25 years, and he must have been tearing his hair out. But I think, though, there is, I'm sorry to be negative, but there is a kind of problem in architectural practice at the moment, which mitigates against my type of office, which is that the forces at work, particularly in the public sector, are driving small to medium-sized practices out of business because you can't get the work, basically. Or when I say small to medium-sized, what I call GP practices, and those people who can turn their hand to more or less anything. If you're a specialist and you only want to build mental hospitals or libraries or something for the rest of your life, then you've got a chance. But if you're a generalist of a certain size, you're really struggling against the big boys. And I think that's a shame. So I think if we come back in 10 or 15 years, my suspicion is there will be a few very large firms and lots of little firms of about 3 or 4 doing houses and kitchens and things. But to make the move, as we did, to get bigger from a small firm, unless you happen to be lucky to capture a lot of private work, is going to be increasingly more and more difficult. So there's going to be this gap in the middle, which is where we are at the moment, actually.
Do you think it's within maybe new generation's possibility for them to do something, or is it very much outside of the profession's hands in a way?
Well, it's political,
exactly.
And it's very much to do with the procurement system that is on the go now. I mean, for example, 20 years ago, we were selected for a competition to design DCA in Dundee. We were the smallest practice on the list, and at that time we had 5 people and a pretty small turnover and a low professional indemnity insurance and all that kind of stuff. None of those questions were asked in those days. You just got selected because people thought you were quite a good architect. Now, a practice of that size wouldn't have a hope in hell of being selected for that sort of job, and I think that's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of maybe similarly, I'm not sure, but the Stirling Prize was announced earlier this week. How do you feel about, not necessarily the winner, but how the Stirling Prize is chosen? What's good about the Stirling Prize is it gets architecture into the public realm, and people start looking at architecture. There used to be a lot of TV programs about the shortlisted schemes, and it was a sort of architectural bake-off, really, and people got very excited and looked at the building, and they would make a semi-serious program about each building. I say semi-serious because they usually got the wrong people to present it, but that's another story. When it comes to the reality of the competition, I always find these things are a little bit odd, in the sense it's a bit like BBC Young Musician of the Year. You're trying to compare a soprano to a double bass player or something. It's extremely difficult. I mean, they've got so many different types of buildings, and I think the criteria by which they're judged is never really clearly spelt out either. So, 1 minute it's a sort of socially important idea for a building where the architecture in a funny sort of way takes back seat. The next minute it's a sort of environmental idea. So I find these things a little bit quixotic, but I mean it's generally a good thing that they exist. And as I say, it's good for publicising buildings and architecture and what's positive about modern architecture, because when I was a student, modern architecture was considered a sort of criminal practice. We had spoilt everything, and a lot of people still think that, actually. And a sort of interest in contemporary design in this country is nowhere near as established as it is in, say, Spain or Portugal or Scandinavia or these places. So,
anything that starts making people think, why am I putting up with rubbish buildings and rubbish housing when we could be doing so much better than this, is to be applauded, really.
Yeah. When you're maybe looking for students to hire, what sort of thing do you look for, either work-wise from university or maybe personality-wise, to make sure they mesh into?
In the old days, it used to be you'd go straight to their hobbies, and because we had a crappy old car, and if they did car maintenance, they were in straight away. No, but to be serious, to be selfish for a minute, we do find somebody who's got maybe presentational skills very handy, actually, because there isn't anybody in the office at the moment who's got that. We've lost our 3D man, so if they've got someone who can really do that sort of thing. I suppose it boils down to, are they interested in architecture?
Yeah.
I mean, that might sound like a strange thing to say, but you'd be surprised how many students get onto a sort of conveyor belt, and they're not quite sure what they're doing, and they come into an office and they're still not sure what they're doing, really. And we like students who like to talk about architecture and are interested and what have you. And so I think sort of bright and sparky personalities are what we look for, basically, but with skills attached if possible, because that helps us, I mean, I'll tell you what we don't expect. We don't expect someone to be technically competent.
Okay.
I mean, that's what you learn in your year
when
out.
You're in practice,
I mean, in the part 2, yes, and that's where most of the surprises come, how incompetent part 2 students can be, and they should be competent by then, but we don't expect that of first year students, I mean, if they've already worked in an office, that can be a good thing, makes them a bit more useful. But we expect over a year to, have a sort of learning curve, really. I mean, we have had some absolutely amazing students, actually, really, really good, and some not so good, but no, I mean, it's a good year-out student is worth their weight in gold, actually.
Yeah.
But they've got to be kind of cheerful. Someone with a bit of personality is kind of, some with a sense of humour, and is always a good idea.
Can chat to everyone.
Well, not too much, but just someone with a bit of personality, really. Yeah. I think that's important, actually, and you can spot that at interview straight away.
Exactly. What is a memory, either from in your time in practice or maybe in university, that is your favourite thing to do with architecture and something you hold on to as a driving memory?
Oh gosh, I can't really. I mean, there's lots of different memories. It makes you sound like I'm sort of about to die, really. But it's memories of people, really. I mean, I had 2 very good teachers who are not with us anymore, Izzy Metzstein and Richard McCormack, and had lots of marvellous occasions with them, and you just know how lucky you were to be at the right place at the right time to learn from them. And I think I've always said the art of teaching is actually to teach self-criticism. So it's very easy, anyone can design a building. It's the question, is it good enough? And the only person who knows whether it's really good enough is yourself. And I think the problem is it's very unpredictable, the amount of time or effort it's going to take. Sometimes a very small building will take a massive amount of time to get right, and sometimes a big building can sort of slot into place in an afternoon, But it's very much to do with self-criticism. So I think those 2 people, plus Ted Cullinan, who's still alive, are the people I've learnt most from in life. I suppose in terms of practice, I can see that we're going to stray into the area of what's your favourite project, and I always think buildings are a bit like children. Not that I have any, but they're all different. But you sort of value them all equally. You don't have favourite children. Well, maybe people do. I don't know, but and they're all different from each other, and they all have different qualities, and they all set out to achieve different things. So I mean, sometimes there are some projects which I think have got a very, very high social mission content, for want of a better phrase. So for example, the Maggie Centre is something very small but very important to me. Years ago we did a school for emotionally disturbed children, which means a lot to me. We've been doing health buildings, which I feel quite passionate about, because we've been pushing the boat out in terms of their plan. At the moment, for example, there's an 80-bed acute mental hospital on site that we've building, and I actually think it's going to revolutionise the design of mental hospitals, which is quite a big claim to make, but it's such a revolutionary plan. I'm very excited about that, and that's all about creating the right environment for people to get better in, and for the staff to work with them. And at the moment, I think it's going to be a very, very interesting project indeed, actually. So I get excited about that sort of thing. But, there are other projects where you get interested in how you've managed to put something very creative into a historic place, wearing my sort of Scarpa hat. Or, there are other projects which are just very sort of, to be blunt, very sort of photogenic. They're very, the project in Sri Lanka is, incredibly just nice-looking building, So we've got thousands of photographs of it. So, I don't know, it depends what sort of mood you're in each day, really.
That's fair. Final question, just to wrap up, and we ask this of everybody. So a student of architecture might go on a grand tour to see cities and buildings around the world. If you could recommend one place, either city or building, what would it be for them to visit on their grand tour?
Gosh, that's a really difficult one. Well, if we're talking about cities... Well, it's spoilt for choice, really, aren't you? Depends. I suppose it depends what you're trying to get out of it, really. If you're talking about, I think the great cities of the world, where, if you're talking about, there's a friend of mine who's now retired, David Dunster, who used to teach at Liverpool, and he used to say that he always took his second-year students to Bologna because it was a wonderful city with no interesting buildings in it. In other words, if you're going to go to the city because it's the city that interests you, rather than there's X, Y, Z of buildings to look at in the city, then you're interested in certain sort of buildings. I actually think, you may be surprised to hear this, but I actually think New York is a bit like that. New York is an amazing city. It doesn't actually have that many interesting buildings in it, funnily enough. It's got, it's got Grand Central Station, it's got the Chrysler building and the Guggenheim, and then you're struggling, actually, to be honest, for really interesting buildings. It's got other things which are wonderful, like delis and markets and all that kind of stuff. But so one of the cities I know very well is Venice, because that's so kind of off the scale, really. It's a difficult, But I just can't answer that question, actually. As for buildings, well, you get even more problem, really. What's your desert island? It's a bit like saying, what's your absolute favourite piece of music? Well, it sort of depends what mood you're in, really, at the time. I was lucky to discover the Castel Vecchio in Verona, and I measured it because there were no drawings of it. And I think that's the thing that has cemented my interest in the building, because I've always said, it sounds like a really old-fashioned idea to make a measured drawing of a building with a tape measure and a pencil and a paper, sort of thing that people used to do 50 or 100 years ago, but we don't do it anymore because we've got cameras and things. But actually, it's a really, really good way of immersing yourself in a single building, if the building's worth immersing yourself in. And then, you just get more and more into the building, and then you learn so much about that particular building and that particular architect. And then I had the lucky break, if you like, of not only doing that, but then having at my disposal all the surviving drawings that he made. So that gave it a completely new dimension, because you could see not only what got built, but you could see how his thought processes progressed towards what got built. And that's actually quite rare. So for me, I'd have to say, inevitably, it's the Castel Vecchio. But there's loads of buildings which I find incredibly inspirational. In London, I always say the Sir John Soane Museum is the best building to visit in London. In Paris, it would be the Maison de Verre. There's Le Corbusier buildings, of course, in France. In America, you still can't beat Frank Lloyd Wright. It's difficult to choose which building by Frank Lloyd Wright to visit, actually. Gosh, in terms of contemporary buildings, I mean, right up to the moment, just in terms of how they work with the landscape and the ecology, I love Glenn Murcutt's work in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult, really. I mean, I could say what I'm less enamoured of, actually, in terms of quite a lot of contemporary architecture, which people think is amazing. I'm not so convinced. But, I mean, again, I think one of the interesting things is that some buildings are classics, There's some alto buildings that you can just go back to again and again. Or I often find it's difficult. You can test a building by going to see it and realising you find it very difficult to leave it. I remember the one and only time I've been to see Ronchamp, I spent about 4 or 5 hours there and still had to sort of peel myself off, because it's very difficult to actually leave. And I remember once I was on my own in a marcha in Finland and phoning up Izzy Metzstein after about 3 hours and saying how incredible it was. He'd never been, and how you just couldn't leave, actually. Yeah. It's a fantastic... That's a very good way of assessing a building, I think, actually. But there are other buildings where you think, oh, this is going to be good. And actually, for example, I've never really thought that, say, I was in Brazil, so obviously you make a beeline to go and see Oscar Niemeyer, and I was in Brasilia, and I have to tell you, after 2 minutes in the Crown of Thorns Cathedral, you want to go. Mm-hmm. There's nothing to see. Okay. It's fine at 1 to 500, but it doesn't get any more interesting, Mm-hmm. So it's, we could sit here all day talking about buildings you should go and see, really. It depends why you want to go and see them, I suppose.
Of course. Well, I think that was a good list.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
I got away quite easily.
Joining us, Richard. I hope you have a good evening and trip back tomorrow.
Tonight.
Oh, tonight. Okay. Well, hope you have a good evening and a safe trip back. Thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening. Next week we'll be having a break because we're all on study trips around Europe. Be sure to look at their Facebook pages because we'll be sharing photos and that as well, I think. Thank you. Bye.